Hello! Today I'm returning to Final Fantasy VIII with a speculative episode that hinges around the pros and cons of the Junctioning System. Now, much like my occasional hypothetical episodes, such as discussing a Final Fantasy VIII sequel story or the potential for prequel installments in Final Fantasy games and so on, this episode focuses on the issues surrounding the Junctioning System, with specific focus on stat boosts and magic use, and how these might be improved or at least reconsidered to create a more positive, optimal and involved gaming experience. And while personally I don't mind the Junction system, I do appreciate and understand why many players do have issues with it, and how at its core the player is fundamentally torn between choosing to use magic in battle, which in Final Fantasy VIII is a finite stocked item, or choosing to boost their stats, which relies on magic. So for example, fire can be appended to a stat such as strength, but to most optimize this strength boost, you must have the maximum amount of fires, so 100. And if you use fire in battle, then your character's going to lose strength because you're diminishing the number that's appended to their stats. So I want to address these things in this episode, propose some suggestions and some designs, and just really prompt a conversation around the pros and cons and improvements available to this system. And while I certainly don't think I've solved it, this is just a set of ideas, a starter for 10, and something to start a conversation around this system and how it could potentially be improved. So, jumping right in, before we get to the system itself, it's important to appreciate the lore and the setting of Final Fantasy VIII. And while some have dismissed the concept of junctioning entirely and suggested they should just reintroduce an MP or a mana points system like in earlier Final Fantasy games, I think we need to appreciate how Final Fantasies have always done really well at creating cohesive worlds, stories and systems of gameplay which integrate with one another and are beholden to one another. And at the very foundation of each of these games we have the lore, we have the setting, of which junctioning, in this case, is a very central part, not only of a system of gameplay, but of the core backbone of the narrative as well. So, looking at the setting and jumping right in, I think we can appreciate the world our characters are operating in, the world that this sort of system is beholden to. So, in the world of Final Fantasy VIII, there are a few parameters that we need to acknowledge. Firstly, there are only finite sources of what we'd call pure magic in the world of Final Fantasy VIII. So we have the elusive deity known as Great Hein, who operates only on the fringes of the story. He's barely mentioned. Beyond this, we have sorceresses such as Rinoa, Adia, Adel, so on. And we have guardian forces. And these are the primary vehicles through which we can utilise magic in Final Fantasy VIII. Alongside this, we have Alone and the Junction machine Alone, which is a core part of the story, but again, quite obtuse and obscure as to the origins of these. But looking to the right-hand side of this graph, we can see how Guardian Forces bridge this narrative and gameplay, and how they sort of work with the player gameplay-wise to create this system known as junctioning. So in the world of Final Fantasy VIII, a human being can junction a guardian force, which is to append them to their consciousness. And by doing this, they can utilise certain magical abilities and produce the facsimile of magic, I suppose, which is called paramagic. So they haven't got the pure magic that would have been wielded by the sorceresses or the guardian forces or Great Hein, for example, but they can produce an imitation of it. And when it comes to acquiring magic, there's various means that they can do this. And human beings can acquire this or channel this by using the draw system or item refinement. And both of these I'll come back to because they are core things that I wouldn't want to dismiss or outrightly remove from Final Fantasy VIII, and they are essential to this setting. And a final thing worth noting, which bridges the narrative with the mechanical as well, is that when a Guardian Force is junctioned or appended to a human being, there is an element of compatibility there as well. So there are various criteria that helps boost compatibility. For example, let's take Ifrit. If you have Ifrit equipped, if you use Ifrit a lot, your compatibility is going to grow. But while you have Ifrit equipped, if you use Ice Magic a lot, or you have Shiva equipped, it's going to hinder your compatibility. So there's various criteria, elemental and otherwise, that improves or hinders your compatibility with a GF. But I think it's a great system, and it's something that I would develop a bit more, actually, and I think it has potential for how we look at how characters can be boosted using the junction system. So, as it stands, if you're a player of Final Fantasy VIII, you'll be familiar with how junctioning looks in the menu screen. You need to equip a Guardian Force before you can really equip any usable or decent abilities, such as magic, such as drawing, and so on. But having Guardian Forces equipped also allows you to boost certain stats. So, for example, strength with fire, as we mentioned. And these GFs can learn certain abilities, such as junction elements to HP, junction elements to strength or vitality or whatever. So this is how you sort of boost your character's stats in Final Fantasy VIII as it stands. We also have item refinement and magic refinement in Final Fantasy VIII. So, as I say, magic is a finite thing. You can only have a maximum of 100, and these diminish as stocked things rather than using mana points, for example, as older games do. So refinement is a core part of the game to really kind of build and gain magics. So this is something we'll come back to and is quite an important part of the game. So the first thing I did is I sort of time boxed an exercise, and I was like, if I had half an hour to solve the junction system, how would I go about doing it? And as I said at the beginning, the core issue around junctioning is that you only have a finite amount of a certain magic, and you can't really use that magic if you want it to optimize your player as much as it possibly can. So looking at other Final Fantasies, looking at other RPGs and what they do, and something I noticed in Final Fantasy IX is that actually you can equip abilities and you can learn them. So once a certain progress bar has been fulfilled, you've learnt that ability and it's just there available for you to sort of have. So a really quick win for Final Fantasy VIII Junction System is maybe, yes, you are stuck between this decision of using fire or having it boosting your stats. However, after a certain amount of time, if you use fire a lot, for example, if you have it equipped to strength or HP or whatever it might be for a certain amount of time, maybe that will boost. Regardless of how many fires you have, you get a permanent stat buff after a certain amount of time. So you're essentially kind of leveling up your stats by having the magic equipped. And as you progress through the game, you may want to change this up because you get better magics. So for example, Meteor, Ultima, something like that, which is going to boost your stats, but you need to have that equipped and you need to grind through the game so that you can 100% kind of buff your stat. So really quick win there. That was a potential way we could go about doing it without changing the kind of fundamentals of the gameplay too much. So moving on, I took a step back from having this granular stocked magic idea. So I kind of took all the magics that we have available in the game and thought, okay, well, if we categorize these at a macro level, so you're less beholden on having certain magics equipped. So rather than being beholden to having 100 fire all of the time, actually, if you just had black magic and you could sort of buff your stats based on the amount of black magic you have or how much affinity you have for black magic. So I took all the magics available in the game, I categorized them into what seemed like the most appropriate groups that were also still faithful to Final Fantasy JRPG conventions. So I've identified black magic, white magic, status magic and time magic, and then I sort of proposed solutions that were based on using these in aggregate of all the various magics that sit within these criteria and buffing your stats based on that. Now obviously there's a lot more black magic in the game than there is white magic, so the stats would have to be configured to sort of balance that and make it fairer. So I looked at this at quite a granular level where, for example, as it currently stands, HP, strength, vitality, all of these things can be determined by what magic you choose append to them. And they might have different qualities. But then I took a step back and I said, well, this is a bit granular, maybe it's a bit complicated. So we could also look at doing something like, and you have this in games like Elden Ring, where you sort of have your master stats, and this impacts the leveling of more granular aspects of your character, such as strength, endurance, so on. So if we had these master stats, such as strength, magic, speed, luck, that informs, certain subcategories. So strength, the master strength stat would inform HP, strength, vitality, which are your physical attributes. The magic master stat might inform magic and spirit. And then basically of the 4 criteria that we have, black, white, time, status, and they can sort of choose between the 4. And what this does is it almost forces you down a route where you're returning to these traditional Final Fantasy roles. Because, for example, if you choose to buff magic, then you're essentially creating a mage. If you choose to buff strength, then you're essentially creating a sort of a melee warrior character. So that was another early idea that I explored. I felt perhaps it was a bit too restrictive, so I broke it down further into elemental attributes. I think something that we should appreciate in Final Fantasy VIII is the huge amount of Guardian Forces that we have, and how all of them have certain attributes that fits them neatly into categories such as thunder, fire, the elements, status, there's plenty of those, time and support. So looking at junctioning this way, and moving away from being reliant on numerical stocked magic, because that's the essence of what I'm trying to escape from, which is having numerical stocked magic informing and hindering the stat boosts that you have. I thought perhaps we could base it around the Guardian Force that you have equipped, plus the amount that you use a certain magic, and this is what equates to your stat boost. And going back to the Guardian Force compatibility that I mentioned earlier, this can play into how your stats are boosted, because for example, if you're Squall and you have Ifrit equipped for the majority of the game, your affinity or compatibility with him is going to boost so much over the course of the game. You keep using fire, that's going to boost your stats. And so there's strategy that comes not from having 100 magic all of the time and never using it, but actually being quite strategic in what characters that you give what GFs, how you use them, and then making sure that you kind of spam that magic to increase your compatibility with that GF, which then kind of informs your stats. So for example, if you're Squall and you have fire equipped to your HP, your strength, whatever it might be, but also you have Ifrit junctioned and you have a really high compatibility with Ifrit, that's in turn going to boost your stats. And it almost doesn't matter how many fire you have, because it derives from how much you use the magic itself and how high your compatibility or affinity is with that particular GF. And for example, when you level, you can have certain things like Squall's affinity with fire increased, Zell's affinity with demi increased, whatever it might be. So what you're doing is you're actually leveling the character's attributes based on how much they're using the magic, based on their affinity to the magic. It's actually encouraging the use of magic rather than kind of making you stock it, which is another route to go as well. And then looking at the GFs and thinking about the GFs a lot more, because they're so important to the story and the mechanics of being able to do anything in battle, it's like, why not introduce them to the fold even more and have them be the source of the stat boost? So this led me on to my final line of thinking, which was Guardian Force compatibility with the character. And this equates to stat growth. Because going back to item refinement and going back for the necessity of refining magic, at the moment, as Final Fantasy VIII is, it's just to have 100 magic all the time, and you want to have that magic. However, if you could do a bit more with refining magic, and there was another purpose for doing so, that would maintain the relevance of item and magic refinement, which is what this route explores here. So, as I say, GF compatibility with a certain character equals the growth of that character's stats. So again, incentivizing a character to have a specific GF equipped, or their own certain set of GFs equipped. So with this route, what we're looking at doing is boosting stats based on GF compatibility, and it's almost sort of offering magic to them. So, and this would have a degree of strategy to it, for example. So if Squall had Ifrit equipped and he wanted to boost his compatibility with Ifrit, you can do so by using Ifrit, you can do so by having him equipped for a long time and not using Shiva, not using Ice. But also, if you were to refine loads of fire magic and sort of gift it to Ifrit, this would boost your stats. So you're basically sacrificing certain numbers of magics to improve your compatibility with Ifrit, which in turn will buff the stats and whatever junction stats Ifrit has available. To add some strategy to it, you wouldn't be able to gift blizzard magic to Ifrit. Potentially you wouldn't be able to gift anything other than fire magic to Ifrit, if we want to adhere to the elements that are at play here. But essentially what we're saying is, I give Ifrit loads of fire, and I have good compatibility with him, and this informs whatever junction stats he might have. So if he has a HP plus junction, Squall's HP is going to be informed by this criteria. And we can buff our compatibility with Ifrit, as I say, by sacrificing loads of fire to give to him. So this incentivizes the magic refinement thing. And of course this will scale, the compatibility will level in complexity based on the conventions of leveling and scaling that RPGs have. So Final Fantasy fans will be aware of this screen here, which is where you learn certain abilities for your GF, such as HP Junction, which enables you to junction magic to boost your HP and so on. What I've done is I've added a boost, probably a poorly termed thing because there's already a boost terminology in Final Fantasy VIII, but this is essentially kind of compatibility and how you're going to buff your stats using your GF. And what you have here is you can cycle through your characters and it will show you the affinity that they have with that particular GF. And what you can do is you can sacrifice magic or offer magic or whatever you want to call it, but basically you can give up magic that you refined to improve your stats with that GF. For example, with Ifrit, because he's a fire elemental, you can only really use fire or specific magics that would be compatible with him, so you certainly can't use Blizzard or Ice. And so what this does is it retains the incentive to keep refining magic, keep refining items into magic, so that you can spam this and sort of try and boost your affinity or your compatibility, whatever you want to call it, as much as possible with a Guardian Force. So we're moving well away now from the numerical stocked magic thing, which in and of itself, you can use as much magic as you want in battle, but you can also use magic to boost your compatibility with your GF. But basically you're not beholden to having 100 at all times. That's not going to impact negatively if you use magic through battle, which is one of the core issues that the Junction system currently has. So here you can boost your affinity with your GF. You can do so with Zell or whoever, but you can basically frame that how you want as the player, and which GFs you want to be most compatible with which players. And so when we come to our Junction screen, you can see how this actually looks. So you might have numerous GFs that have Junction plus HP, but the one you determine is the one that you have the most compatibility with. So for example, you have Ifrit, you have Diablos, perhaps Ifrit has a better affinity for Squall, so then it makes sense that he is the one that you junction HP for. And each Guardian Force may have their own criteria. Maybe naturally from a base level, Ifrit does make HP stronger, but actually maybe Diablos at a base level makes magic stronger based on their respective qualities, their respective elements. So there's a lot of parameters at play, but essentially we're solving this by making it about the character's relationship to the Guardian Force. So that's a few ideas around that. And I suppose lastly, the only thing I haven't really touched on, and it was kind of a consistent thought across most of these, was elemental attack defense and status attack defense. And for these, they are sort of novelties. I thought in this case they are sort of okay as they are, but the way that we could boost them so that we are less reliant on having 100 bios or 100 blind all of the time is actually much like one of my earlier options showed. You could permanently learn them and choose between them as a character. And the scale of the leveling, the scale of learning them permanently, would depend on perhaps how many you have, how often you use them, so on and so forth. So I do think that elements and status effects in terms of weaponry and defense is more of a novelty and more of a secondary feature, as they are in most Final Fantasy games. And actually the real focus is on how we level these characters and how we buff their stats without hindering the use of magic or any other of the battle and gameplay elements. So that's been a brief look at the Junction system, potential routes around it, and alternatives to it. I am not particularly wedded to any of these ideas. I think the risk always is when you're doing discovery and design exploration is not seeing the forest through the trees and actually coming up with something that's even more convoluted than what currently exists. However, I've tried maintaining a faithfulness to the lore and the setting of Final Fantasy VIII. I've tried utilising what is already there, because I don't think much of it is broken. I think actually in principle Final Fantasy VIII is a very sound and cohesive game. I really wanted to draw in the use of Guardian Forces and their respective attributes, and stuff like compatibility, which is much more of a sub thing. It's not really something that's overtly mentioned in the game, but it does inform aspects of gameplay in a very subtle way. So actually bringing that front and centre, allowing players to have and grow compatibility with either magic or Guardian Forces, which in turn would buff their stats, rather than relying on the numerical aspect, is at the core of what I've been looking at doing here. So there we have it. I would love to hear other thoughts and opinions as to how junctioning and magic could work in Final Fantasy VIII. Finally, if you're a first-time watcher and you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing and subscribing, and check out some of my other Final Fantasy episodes available.